December 18, 1943. Château de Vincennes, eastern Paris. Frost coated the cobblestones in the courtyard where 12 wooden stakes stood arranged in a precise line. Dawn was 2 hours away. A single guard walked the perimeter, his breath visible in the cold air, boots crunching against ice-hardened ground. Inside the fortress walls, 27 prisoners waited in separate cells, each man alone with his thoughts, each man scheduled to die at sunrise. Among them was Jacques Dubois. 26 years old. Former violinist with the Paris Conservatoire. Resistance courier. Captured 3 weeks earlier carrying forged identity papers and a list of safe houses written in music notation on sheet music for Debussy's Clair de Lune. The Gestapo had decoded it within hours. His interrogation lasted 6 days. They wanted names. He gave them silence. They wanted locations. He gave them nothing. On the 7th day, they stopped asking questions. The trial took 17 minutes. The sentence was death by firing squad. Standard procedure for resistance operatives caught in acts of sabotage or espionage. But Jacques Dubois had not been caught in an act of sabotage. He had been caught carrying information. Under German military law, that made him a spy, not a saboteur. Spies were hanged. Saboteurs faced firing squads. The distinction mattered only in the method of execution, not in the outcome. Dead was dead. He sat in cell number 9. Stone walls. Iron door. A wooden bench. A metal bucket. No heat. The cold penetrated his thin cotton prison uniform, seeped into his bones, made his fingers ache. His hands trembled, not from fear but from cold. A musician's hands. Sensitive to temperature, to texture, to the weight of strings beneath fingertips. He had not touched a violin in 3 weeks. The deprivation felt physical. He found himself making fingering motions in the darkness, practicing scales on invisible strings, hearing melodies that existed only in memory. Bach's Chaconne in D minor. Beethoven's Violin Concerto. The Paganini caprices he had performed at his graduation recital. The guard outside his cell changed at midnight. New boots. Heavier tread. A younger man by the sound of it. Someone who had not yet learned to walk quietly. In the administrative building, Major Franz Weber reviewed the execution orders. 27 prisoners. 27 wooden stakes. 70 execution squad members already selected. The schedule was precise. First group at 6 o'clock. Second at 6:30. Third at 7 o'clock. All completed before full daylight. Weber was 43 years old. Career Wehrmacht officer. He had witnessed executions before. Russia, Poland, France. They were administrative procedures now. Forms to sign. Schedules to maintain. Bodies to dispose of. He no longer thought about the faces. The protocol was clear. Prisoners brought from cells to courtyard. Tied to stakes. Final statements permitted if brief. Firing squad assembled in 3 rows. First row kneeling. Second row standing. Third row backup. 9 rifles per prisoner. 7 loaded with live ammunition. 2 with blanks. No one knew which rifles held blanks. Psychology meant to ease the burden on the executioners. The chaplain arrived at 2 o'clock. Father Michel. Local priest conscripted to provide final rites. He moved from cell to cell, offering prayers, hearing confessions, speaking words of comfort that felt hollow against stone walls. Some prisoners wanted him. Some refused him. Some just stared in silence. When he reached cell number 9, he found Jacques Dubois sitting on the bench with his eyes closed, hands moving in patterns against his knees. The priest recognized the motion. His sister had been a pianist. He knew what practice looked like. Music? Father Michel asked. Jacques opened his eyes. Bartók. Violin Concerto No. 2. I was supposed to perform it next month at the Opera Garnier. You're a violinist. I was a violinist. The distinction hung in the cold air. Past tense. The reality of approaching death made everything past tense. Who you were became who you had been. The future collapsed into a few remaining hours. Father Michel offered prayers. Jacques declined. Not from lack of faith but from a different kind of belief. He believed in music. He believed that beauty existed independent of politics or war or ideology. He believed that art transcended the temporary madness of nations. He believed these things even here, even now, even with death coming at sunrise. The priest moved to the next cell. Jacques returned to his silent practice. Bartók's Concerto. The second movement. The slow section where melody and accompaniment merged into a single voice of longing. He heard every note. He felt the bow weight against strings. He saw the conductor's hands marking time. In the barracks, the execution squad prepared. Young soldiers. Most had never participated in a firing squad before. Standard rotation. Every soldier in the garrison served eventually. Training emphasized mechanical precision. You aimed at the target. You fired when ordered. You did not think about who the target was or why they were there. Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann briefed them at 3 o'clock. You will form 3 ranks. Front rank kneeling. Second rank standing behind. Third rank standing behind second. You will shoulder weapons on command. You will aim on command. You will fire on command. You will not lower weapons until dismissed. The youngest soldier, Private Hans Richter, raised his hand. How do we know which prisoners are which? It doesn't matter which prisoners are which, Hoffmann said. They are all condemned. You follow orders. Yes, Sergeant. But it did matter. Every soldier knew it mattered. These were not soldiers they were executing. These were civilians. French civilians. Some were resistance fighters. Some were political prisoners. Some were there because they had sheltered Jews or hidden weapons or printed illegal newspapers. The reasons varied. The outcome was identical. In the fortress chapel, Father Michel knelt before the altar and prayed for forgiveness. Not for the prisoners but for himself. For his role in this. For offering comfort that made the procedure more efficient. For being the human face on an inhuman process. He wondered if his presence made it easier for the prisoners or for the Germans. He suspected it was the latter. The Germans wanted ritual. They wanted procedure. They wanted everything documented and sanctified and proper. Even murder could be made respectable with the right paperwork and the right prayers. At 4 o'clock, the kitchen prepared the final meals. Coffee. Bread. Sometimes cheese if supplies permitted. The food was delivered to the cells in tin cups and on metal plates. Most prisoners barely touched it. Eating felt like acceptance. Refusing felt like defiance. Small gestures carried enormous weight in the final hours. Jacques received his coffee. It was weak, bitter, lukewarm. He drank it anyway. The warmth helped. The caffeine sharpened his mind. He wanted to be present for what came next. He did not want fear or cold or hunger to blur the experience. He thought about his mother. She would learn of his death through official channels. A letter from the German authorities. He hoped someone from the resistance would reach her first, would tell her that he had not betrayed anyone, that he had remained silent. That mattered to him more than the execution itself. His last performance had been 6 months ago. Ravel's Tzigan at a private concert in a basement on Rue de la Huchette. 40 people in attendance. Candles instead of electric light. Wine instead of champagne. The audience sat on wooden chairs and listened with intensity that made the acoustics irrelevant. He remembered the applause. The way it echoed off the low ceiling. The way people approached afterward to shake his hand, to thank him for creating beauty in a time of ugliness. One woman had cried. She said the music made her remember what peace sounded like. At 5 o'clock, the first light appeared on the eastern horizon. Not sunrise yet. Just the faint gray promise of coming day. The cold intensified before dawn. Always the coldest moment. The earth exhaling its heat into the void above. The guards began moving through the cell block. Heavy boots. Jangling keys. Voices calling out numbers. Cell 4. Cell 7. Cell 12. The execution order was not sequential. Some administrative logic determined who died first. Jacques heard them approaching. Cell 6. Cell 8. They would reach cell 9 soon. His heart rate increased despite his intentions to remain calm. The body had its own responses to mortality. Ancient reflexes deeper than conscious thought. The key turned in his lock. The door opened. 2 guards entered. Neither met his eyes. "Come with us," one said in accented French. He stood. His legs were stiff from sitting. He stretched briefly, musician's habit, keeping the body limber even when the situation was absurd. They led him through corridors he had never seen before. Stone walls. Arched ceilings. Medieval architecture repurposed for modern efficiency. The fortress had held prisoners for centuries. Kings and revolutionaries and common criminals. Now it held resistance fighters. Other prisoners joined the procession. 12 men total in the first group. They moved in single file, flanked by guards. No one spoke. Conversation was not forbidden, but what was there to say? They all knew where they were going. The courtyard appeared ahead. Iron gate. Grey dawn light. The 12 stakes visible now. Ropes already attached. Everything prepared. Jacques felt his breathing accelerate. He focused on the rhythm. In for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. The same breathing technique he used before performances. Stage fright and execution anxiety produced similar physical responses. The body could not distinguish between performing Beethoven and facing death. Major Weber stood in the center of the courtyard with a clipboard. Professional bearing. Proper uniform. He looked more like a bureaucrat than an executioner. Perhaps that was the point. Making death administrative made it tolerable. The prisoners were positioned at the stakes. Guards tied their hands behind them. The rope was rough against Jacques' wrists. Not tight enough to cause pain. Just tight enough to prevent movement. He looked at the men beside him. Some prayed. Some wept quietly. Some stared ahead with expressions that had moved beyond fear into acceptance. One man appeared to be singing under his breath. Jacques could not hear the words but recognized the melody. La Marseillaise. France's anthem. A final act of defiance. The firing squad marched into position. 70 men. 7 rows of 10. They formed 3 ranks as instructed. Front rank knelt. The rifles pointed forward. Morning light gleamed on metal barrels. Father Michel walked along the line of prisoners, offering final blessings. When he reached Jacques, he paused. "Is there anything you need to say?" Jacques thought about this. Last words. Final statements. What did you say when life compressed into a single sentence? "Tell my mother I thought about her violin," he said finally. "The one she played when I was a child. Tell her I was thinking about how it sounded." The priest nodded. He moved to the next prisoner. Major Weber consulted his clipboard. Proper procedure required reading the charges and sentences aloud. He cleared his throat and began. The words blurred together. Espionage. Sabotage. Resistance activities. Condemned to death. The language was formal, bloodless, designed to transform execution into legal process. Jacques stopped listening. He looked at the sky instead. Dawn was coming. The gray was turning pale blue along the eastern edge. Stars faded. Morning arrived despite everything. He thought about music. About Bach and Bartók and Beethoven. About the way melody could carry emotion that language could not reach. About the way harmony created tension and release. About the way rhythm could make time itself feel different. He thought about his violin. A 1924 French instrument made by Maurice Allard. Not a Stradivarius or a Guarneri, but it had a voice. Rich in the lower registers. Bright in the higher. Responsive to subtle changes in bow pressure. He could make it sing or whisper or shout. Where was it now? Confiscated. Sitting in some German storage room with other seized property. Would anyone ever play it again? Would it collect dust until it dried out and cracked? Instruments needed to be played. They were meant for music, not storage. The thought made him sadder than his approaching death. He would die. That was certain. But the violin should not. It had years left. Decades. A century if properly maintained. Major Weber finished reading the charges. The moment had arrived. He raised his hand to give the command. And then, something happened. From cell block D, 300 yards from the execution courtyard, came the sound of music. Not imagined. Not remembered. Actual physical sound waves traveling through cold morning air. A violin. Someone was playing a violin. The melody was Schubert. Ave Maria. The sacred piece written for voice but adapted countless times for instruments. The opening notes floated across the fortress grounds with clarity that made the dawn seem to pause. Every head turned. Prisoners. Guards. The firing squad. Major Weber. Father Michel. Everyone looked toward the source of the sound. The violin continued. The player knew the piece intimately. Every phrase shaped with precision. Every dynamic carefully controlled. Vibrato used sparingly, tastefully. This was not amateur playing. This was professional-level musicianship. Jacques recognized the quality immediately. Whoever was playing had training. Conservatory training. The tone was pure, the intonation perfect. The bow strokes were confident. This was someone who understood music not as entertainment but as language. The guards at the courtyard entrance stood frozen. Protocol did not cover this situation. There was no procedure for music during executions. Major Weber lowered his hand. The firing squad remained at attention, rifles still aimed, but the moment had fractured. The mechanical inevitability of the execution had been interrupted by something human. Something beautiful. Something that made the procedure feel suddenly obscene. The violin played through the first verse. Slow tempo. Meditative. The melody rose and fell with the grace of a prayer. No accompaniment. Just the single instrument carrying the complete musical thought. In his cell, Lieutenant Hans Müller sat with his violin resting against his shoulder. His eyes were closed. His fingers moved across the fingerboard with muscle memory developed through decades of practice. He had not planned this. He had been awake since 4 o'clock, lying on his bunk, listening to the sounds of preparation filtering through the fortress. The keys. The boots. The voices. He knew what was happening. Everyone in the garrison knew. Execution morning. He had tried to ignore it. But when he heard the prisoners being marched to the courtyard, when he heard the charges being read, something inside him refused silence. He stood. He retrieved his violin from its case. He began to play. Müller was 34 years old. Violinist with the Dresden Philharmonic before the war. Conscripted in 1940. Served on the Eastern Front until frostbite damaged his left hand. Medical discharge from combat duty. Reassignment to administrative positions. Currently stationed at Château de Vincennes as a logistics officer managing supply chains. He had not played publicly since being drafted. The violin stayed in its case. A reminder of the life he had left behind. A life that felt increasingly distant and impossible to reclaim. But this morning, the violin spoke. And he let it. The music carried across the courtyard. Jacques felt tears on his cheeks. Not from fear. From recognition. From the sudden appearance of beauty in a place designed for death. From the knowledge that somewhere in this fortress was another musician who understood that some things transcended war. The firing squad members lowered their rifles slightly. Not on command. Just a subtle relaxation. The tension that had built toward the act of killing dissipated. The mechanical solidarity required for group execution dissolved into individual consciousness. They became men again instead of an execution mechanism. Sergeant Hoffman looked at Major Weber. The major looked back. Neither spoke. The violin continued. Müller played through the second verse. His tone was pure. No vibrato now. Straight tone. Letting the melody carry its own emotion without artificial enhancement. This was how sacred music should sound. Simple. Direct. Honest. He thought about the prisoners in the courtyard. He did not know their names or their crimes. He only knew they were about to die. And he knew that they deserved better than dying in silence. Everyone deserved beauty in their final moments. Everyone deserved to remember that humanity existed. In the courtyard, Father Michel moved toward Major Weber. "Sir," he said quietly. "What?" Weber's voice was sharp. "The music. I hear it. Should we what? Stop it? How do you stop music, Father?" The priest had no answer. Weber looked at the prisoners tied to the stakes. He looked at the firing squad. He looked at the empty sky above. He was 43 years old. He had joined the army because his father had been an army officer and his grandfather before that. It was family tradition. It was duty. But duty was complex. It asked you to do things that felt wrong. It justified actions by reference to orders and regulations and the needs of the state. It made the abnormal seem normal through repetition. He had witnessed executions before. He had ordered executions before. Each time, he reminded himself that these were not innocents. These were resistance fighters. Saboteurs. Spies. People who actively worked to undermine German authority. They knew the risks. They chose their paths. But in this moment, with Schubert's Ave Maria floating through the dawn air, that rationalization felt hollow. These were people. Human beings. And someone was playing music for them. Müller transitioned seamlessly from Schubert to Bach. Partita No. 2 in D minor. The Saraband. Slow, stately, profound. The music of cosmic mathematics transformed into emotion. Jacques recognized it instantly. He had performed this piece dozens of times. He knew every phrase. He knew where the technical challenges lived. He knew the moment in the middle section where the melody climbed to a high A and held there, suspended, before resolving downward. Müller reached that moment. He held the note. Perfect intonation. Perfect bow control. Time stretched. The note seemed eternal. In that suspended moment, something shifted in the courtyard. The inevitability that had governed the morning crumbled. The execution was supposed to happen at 6 o'clock. It was now 6:07. The schedule had been disrupted. The mechanism had jammed. One prisoner began to weep openly. Not from fear but from gratitude. From the gift of beauty before death. From knowing that somewhere in the machinery of war and occupation was a person who valued music more than orders. The firing squad members stood motionless. Private Hans Richter, the youngest, felt his hands trembling. He had been ready to fire. He had steeled himself for the recoil and the sound and the sight of bodies jerking against ropes. But music changed things. Music made the prisoners human in ways that charges and crimes could not erase. Sergeant Hoffmann looked at his men. He saw the change. He saw the way the music had broken the collective will required for execution. You could not make men kill while beauty played in the background. The two acts could not coexist. He walked to Major Weber. "Sir, we should. I know what we should do, Sergeant. The schedule. The schedule can wait." The word surprised Weber as much as they surprised Hoffmann. But they were true. The schedule could wait. The war could wait. The occupation could wait. For 5 minutes, while a German soldier played Bach for French resistance fighters, everything could wait. Müller played through the saraband without hurry. He was not trying to delay the execution. He was not making a political statement. He was simply playing music for people who were about to die. It was the most basic human gesture he could imagine. When he finished the Bach, he did not stop. He moved to Brahms. The slow movement from the violin concerto. The passage where the soloist plays alone, without orchestra, establishing the emotional center of the entire work. The melody was simple. Almost folk-like. But Brahms had woven into it a depth of feeling that bordered on unbearable. Longing and loss and acceptance all present simultaneously. Jacques closed his eyes and listened. He was still tied to the stake. The firing squad still faced him. Death still waited. But for these minutes, while the music played, none of that mattered as much as the sound itself. He thought about all the hours he had spent practicing. All the scales and études and repertoire. All the late nights in practice rooms. All the performances in concert halls and churches and living rooms. All of it leading to this moment. Standing in an execution courtyard, listening to another violinist play Brahms at sunrise. The absurdity should have been overwhelming. But instead, it felt right. Music was meant for moments like this. Moments when words failed. Moments when the only appropriate response to the weight of existence was beauty. Muller felt his left hand beginning to tire. The frostbite damage made extended playing difficult. His fingers did not move as freely as they once had. But he kept playing. He would play until he could not play anymore. The Brahms concluded. He lowered the violin. He waited. He wondered if the execution would resume now. If his brief interruption had changed anything. In the courtyard, Major Weber looked at Father Michel. The priest looked back. "What would you have me do, Father?" Weber asked. "I don't know. The orders are clear. Orders can be reinterpreted." "Can they? By what authority?" "By the authority of conscience." Weber laughed bitterly. "Conscience. We abandoned conscience when we invaded Poland. We abandoned it in Russia. We abandoned it in 1,000 villages whose names I can't remember. You think it matters here? You think music changes anything?" "I think it already has," Father Michel said quietly. "Look at them." Weber looked at the firing squad. He saw the change. He saw men who moments ago had been ready to execute orders now standing with rifles lowered, faces troubled, unity broken. He looked at the prisoners. He saw them watching the eastern horizon where light continued to grow. He saw them breathing. Living. Present. And he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Stand down," Major Weber said. Sergeant Hoffman stared at him. "Sir. You heard the order. Stand down. The execution is postponed." The word hung in the cold air. Postponed. Not cancelled. Not commuted. Postponed. A delay. A temporary reprieve. But temporary or not, it meant the men tied to stakes would not die at 6 o'clock. The firing squad lowered their rifles. Relief and confusion showed on their faces in equal measure. They had been prepared to kill. They had been mentally ready. The sudden reversal left them unmoored. "Return to barracks," Weber ordered. Dismissed. The squad members filed away. Some glanced back at the prisoners. Most walked quickly, eager to leave the courtyard and the choice they had almost made. Weber approached the prisoners. He looked at each face. Young men. Older men. All of them exhausted. All of them showing the physical toll of imprisonment and interrogation. He stopped in front of Jacques. "You're a musician." It was not a question. Weber had seen the finger movements. The private practice. The way Jacques had listened to the distant violin with closed eyes. "Yes," Jacques said. "What instrument?" "Violin." "Of course." Weber almost smiled. "Of course it's violin." He turned to the guards. "Return them to their cells. Keep the schedule for the second group postponed. I need to make a report." The guards began untying the prisoners. Ropes loosened. Hands freed. The men stood unsteadily. Several fell to their knees. Not from weakness but from the sudden overwhelming reality of still being alive. Jacques rubbed his wrists where the rope had abraded skin. He looked at the sky. Full dawn now. Blue spreading from east to west. Morning birds beginning their songs. The world continued despite everything. As guards led them back toward the cell blocks, Jacques heard the distant violin again. Muller was playing. Something French this time. 4. The Berceuse. A lullaby. Music for sleeping or dying. Music for the threshold between consciousness and oblivion. In his office, Major Weber sat at his desk and stared at the telephone. He needed to report the postponement. There would be questions. Why had he delayed? What circumstances justified disrupting the schedule? How long would the postponement last? He had no answers. None that would satisfy superior officers. None that would protect him from accusations of weakness or sentiment or ideological corruption. The truth was simple and impossible to explain. He had delayed the execution because a German soldier was playing Schubert for French resistance fighters, and he could not order men to kill while beauty existed in the same space. He picked up the telephone. Put it down. Picked it up again. Finally, he began writing a report instead. Written words could be carefully chosen. Telephone conversations could not be controlled. He needed time to construct an explanation that sounded military rather than emotional. At 0607 hours, the execution schedule was temporarily postponed due to unexpected circumstances requiring investigation, he wrote. Vague. Bureaucratic. Technically accurate. He continued. The prisoners have been returned to their cells. Security remains tight. No escape attempts. The execution will proceed once circumstances are clarified. What circumstances? He did not specify. Let Berlin interpret as they wished. In cell block D, Lieutenant Müller put his violin back in its case. His left hand ached. His fingers were stiff. But he had played. He had interrupted an execution with music. He had no idea whether it mattered. Whether it changed anything. Whether anyone beyond the courtyard had even heard. A knock on his door. He opened it. Sergeant Hoffmann stood there. Lieutenant, Hoffmann said formally. Sergeant. That was you. Playing. Yes. Why? Müller considered the question. Why had he played? Idealism? Rebellion? Instinct? None of those words seemed adequate. Because silence is worse, he said finally. Hoffmann nodded slowly. He was 31 years old. He had a wife and 2 daughters in Munich. He wanted to survive the war. He wanted to go home. He did not want to participate in firing squads. He did not want to execute prisoners. But duty demanded these things. And until this morning, he had accepted that. Duty was duty. The major postponed the execution, Hoffmann said. I heard. Because of your music. Perhaps. They'll still die. You know that. I know. Then what did your music change? Müller looked at his violin case. It changed this morning. Perhaps that's enough. Back in cell 9, Jacques sat on a wooden bench and tried to understand what had happened. He had been seconds from death. The firing squad had been assembled. The rifles had been aimed. And then music arrived and everything stopped. He felt no relief. Only suspension. The execution had been postponed, not cancelled. He would still die. Later today. Tomorrow. Next week. The timing had changed, not the outcome. But those minutes in the courtyard, listening to the distant violin, had been a gift. They had reminded him why he loved music. Why he had chosen to become a violinist rather than pursuing a safer career. Why beauty mattered. Music was the opposite of war. War destroyed. Music created. War divided people into sides. Music reminded them of shared humanity. War simplified everything into enemy and ally. Music complicated everything with emotion and nuance and ambiguity. The German soldier who played this morning, Jacques did not know his name or his rank or his story. But that soldier had given him something more valuable than life. He had given him meaning. Father Michel walked through the cell blocks, checking on the prisoners who had been returned. Most were silent. Some prayed. A few asked questions. When will they execute us? Will they execute us? What happens now? He had no answers. He was as confused as they were. Executions had been postponed before. Paperwork errors. Missing signatures. Superior officers requesting additional information. But never because of music. Never because a German soldier decided to play violin at dawn. When he reached Jacques, the priest sat on the bench beside him. That was remarkable, Father Michel said. It was Schubert, Jacques replied. And Bach. And Brahms. I meant what it represented. I know what you meant. But I prefer thinking about what it was. Music. Pure and simple. The priest smiled. You're still the musician. Even here. Especially here. In the administrative building, Major Weber completed his report. It was deliberately vague. Technically accurate but emotionally empty. It would buy him time. Perhaps 2 days. Perhaps a week. Eventually, Berlin would demand specifics. Eventually, he would need to explain. But not today. Today he had given 12 men a few more hours of life. Whether that was mercy or cruelty depended on perspective. He thought about the violinist. Müller. The logistics officer from Dresden. Weber had read his file. Excellent service record until the frostbite. Conscientious. Reliable. No indication of ideological problems. Playing music for condemned prisoners was not technically a violation of regulations. There was no rule against it. Because no one had ever thought such a rule would be necessary. Who would play music during an execution? Weber wondered if he should reprimand Müller. Issue a formal warning. But for what? Making the morning more complicated? Introducing beauty where only efficiency should exist? He decided to do nothing. Sometimes doing nothing was its own form of action. The day progressed. Morning became afternoon. The fortress settled into routine. Guards walked their rounds. Prisoners waited in cells. Administrative staff processed paperwork. Life continued with the mechanical regularity that defined military operations. But something had changed. An invisible shift that everyone felt but no one could name. The execution that did not happen had altered the atmosphere. Made everything feel temporary and uncertain. In cell 9, Jacques practiced his silent scales. His fingers moved through patterns that no longer produced sound. First position exercises. Shifting drills. Double stops. His hands remembered everything even without the instrument. He thought about the German violinist. He wondered if they could have met in a different context. Two musicians from different countries sharing knowledge, exchanging techniques, performing together. The war made such possibilities seem like fantasies. But they were real possibilities. Before the war, musicians crossed borders freely. Orchestras toured internationally. Conservatory students studied with masters regardless of nationality. Music had been a language that transcended politics. Would it be that way again? After the war ended, whenever that was, however that happened, would musicians rebuild those connections? Or would the hatred run too deep? Would national boundaries harden into permanent divisions? He did not know. He might not live to see it. But the fact that the question existed gave him something to think about beyond his own mortality. Evening arrived. The fortress settled into darkness. Guards lit lamps. Prisoners received their evening meal. Bread. Soup. Water. The same as always. Jacques ate slowly. Each bite felt significant. He was alive to taste it. That was something. In cell block D, Lieutenant Müller sat at his desk and wrote a letter to his wife. He told her about the weather. About his duties. About the violin he had finally taken from its case. He did not tell her about the execution. About the prisoners. About playing Schubert at dawn. Some things could not be written in letters that would be read by censors. But she would understand anyway. She knew him. She knew that music mattered to him more than any ideology or orders or military doctrine. She would read between the lines and understand that he had done something that felt necessary. Father Michel conducted evening prayers in the chapel. A dozen soldiers attended. More than usual. Something about the day had made men feel the need for spiritual reassurance. He spoke about mercy. About grace. About the small acts of humanity that persist even in darkness. He did not mention the execution or the music explicitly. But everyone understood what he was talking about. Major Weber worked late in his office. He wrote additional reports. Filled out forms. Maintained the appearance of normalcy. But his mind kept returning to the courtyard. To the moment when he had lowered his hand and ordered the firing squad to stand down. He had made that choice. He could have ignored the music. Could have followed the schedule. Could have completed the execution as planned. The prisoners would have died. The war would have continued. No one would have questioned his actions. But he had chosen differently. And now he lived with the consequences of that choice. The uncertainty. The questions. The knowledge that his decision would eventually require justification. He wondered if he would make the same choice again. Given the same circumstances. The same moment. The same music. He suspected he would. Despite everything. Despite the complications and the risks and the career implications. He would stop the execution again. Because some things mattered more than orders. Night deepened. The fortress grew quiet. Only the essential guards remained on duty. Everyone else slept or tried to sleep. Jacques lay on his wooden bench and listened to the silence. No music tonight. Just the wind outside and the occasional sound of boots on stone corridors. He thought about tomorrow. Would the execution resume? Would he stand at the stake again with rifles aimed at his chest? Would there be music? He hoped there would be music. Even if he died. Especially if he died. Better to die with beauty in your ears than with silence. 3 days later, new orders arrived from Berlin. Major Weber opened the sealed envelope at his desk. Official Wehrmacht letterhead. Stamped with numerous seals and signatures. The kind of document that allowed no interpretation, no discretion, no delay. He read slowly. The orders were specific. The 27 prisoners currently held at Château de Vincennes were to be transferred to Frasnes prison within 48 hours. From there, they would be transported to Germany for labor assignment. Not execution. Labor assignment. The death sentences had been commuted. No explanation given. No justification provided. Just a bureaucratic reversal that transformed condemned men into forced laborers. Weber read the orders 3 times. He looked for hidden meanings. Found none. The language was clear. Transfer. Labor. Not execution. He wondered if his report had influenced this. If someone in Berlin had read his deliberately vague description of unexpected circumstances and decided to investigate. If that investigation had revealed complications that made execution politically inconvenient. Or perhaps it was simple logistics. Germany needed workers. French prisoners could fill that need. Dead prisoners produced nothing. Living prisoners could be useful. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. The men would live. At least for now. At least until circumstances changed again. He called for Sergeant Hoffmann. Prepare prisoner transfer. 27 men. 48 hours. Hoffmann saluted. Yes, sir. To where? Frasnes. Then Germany. The executions are cancelled. Labor assignment instead. Hoffmann's face showed surprise, then relief. He had participated in executions before. He would participate in them again. But avoiding this particular one felt like grace. Like a small mercy in an unmerciful war. The news spread through the fortress quickly. Guards told other guards. Administrative staff whispered to each other. By evening, everyone knew. The execution had been cancelled. The prisoners would live. Father Michel received the news from a guard during evening rounds. He went immediately to the chapel and knelt. He had prayed for mercy. Not expecting it. Just offering hope into the void. And somehow, impossibly, mercy had arrived. He did not believe God worked through Wehrmacht administrative orders. But he believed God worked through people. Through choices. Through moments when someone decided that following protocol mattered less than recognizing humanity. Maybe Major Weber had filed a report that raised questions. Maybe someone in Berlin had read it and decided execution was not the right response. Maybe a chain of small decisions had accumulated into this outcome. Or maybe it was the music. Maybe Lieutenant Muller's violin had introduced an element of beauty that could not be ignored. Maybe someone heard about the German soldier playing Schubert for French prisoners and thought, this changes something. Father Michel would never know. But he was grateful anyway. In cell 9, a guard delivered the news to Jacques. Transfer orders. 2 days. You're going to Germany. Jacques stared at him. Not execution. No. Labor camp. The words hung between them. Labor camp. Not freedom. Not release. But also not death. A different kind of prison. A different kind of suffering. But alive. Still alive. When the guard left, Jacques sat on his bench and tried to process the information. He had prepared himself for death. Had accepted it. Had made peace with it. Now he needed to unmake that peace. Needed to return to the mindset of survival instead of acceptance. He felt no joy. Just confusion and a strange disappointment. He had been ready. The waiting was over. And now it was beginning again. That night, Lieutenant Müller heard about the transfer orders. He sat in his quarters with his violin and did not play. Just held it. The wood was smooth under his fingers. The strings were perfectly tuned. The instrument was ready for music. But he could not bring himself to play. The moment had passed. The execution courtyard was empty. The prisoners were being transferred. His music had interrupted one morning but could not stop the war. He wondered about the violinist. The French prisoner whose finger movements had given him away. Would that man survive Germany? Would he play violin again? Would he remember the dawn when a German soldier played Bach while he stood tied to a stake? Probably not. Memory was selective. Trauma obscured beauty. The prisoner would remember the execution courtyard and the rifles and the fear. Not the music. But maybe somewhere, in some future moment, a phrase of Schubert would drift through his mind and he would pause. Would remember. Would recognize that humanity had existed even there. Müller hoped so. He hoped his playing had given the prisoner something more than a delay. Some small proof that music transcended ideology. That beauty persisted even in darkness. The transfer occurred on schedule. Gray buses with barred windows. Armed guards. The 27 prisoners were loaded in groups, handcuffed, silent. They filed past the courtyard where they had stood facing the firing squad. Jacques looked at the wooden stakes. Still there. Waiting for the next group. The next execution. Death postponed was not death prevented. It just happened to someone else. Father Michel watched from the fortress steps. He made the sign of the cross as each bus departed. Blessing. Prayer. Hope. He would never see these men again. Would never know their fates. But he could offer this small gesture. Major Weber observed from his office window. The transfer completed his responsibilities regarding these prisoners. Whatever happened to them in Germany was not his concern. His records would show, received 27 prisoners, detained for 3 weeks, transferred per orders from Berlin. Administrative completion. But he would remember the morning the execution did not happen. Would remember the distant sound of violin. Would remember the moment when he chose to postpone instead of proceed. That choice would define him more than any military action he participated in. Not heroic. Not noble. Just human. A small deviation from protocol that acknowledged beauty had value even in wartime. The buses disappeared down the road toward Paris. Toward Freyne's prison. Toward Germany. Toward an uncertain future that was nonetheless a future. The men were alive. For now. That counted for something. In the months that followed, the story circulated quietly among guards and administrative staff. About the German violinist who played music during an execution. About the major who postponed the firing squad. About the morning when beauty interrupted death. Details changed with each retelling. Some versions made Müller's playing more dramatic. Some made Weber's decision more heroic. Some added elements that had never happened. The story became legend. Legend became myth. But the core remained true. A musician played. An execution stopped. Men lived who would have died. That was what mattered. The war continued. More prisoners arrived at Château de Vincennes. More executions occurred. Life and death maintained their wartime rhythm. But something had changed in the fortress. A memory of music. A reminder that choices existed even within systems that discouraged choice. Guards who had been in the courtyard that morning sometimes paused when they walked past. Remembering. The firing squad members who had lowered their rifles carried that moment with them through the rest of the war. The prisoners who had been transferred wrote letters home when they could. Some survived. Some did not. Jacques survived. He spent 18 months in a labor camp near Munich. Loading freight. Moving supplies. Surviving day by day. His hands grew calloused. His shoulders grew strong. But his fingers never forgot their training. In rare quiet moments, he practiced silently. Scales. Arpeggios. Repertoire he had performed years ago. The music existed in his memory even when the instrument did not exist in his hands. He remembered the morning in the courtyard. Remembered the distant violin. Remembered Schubert and Bach and Brahms floating through dawn air. He remembered thinking he would die. Remembered the rifles aimed at his chest. And he remembered the music that stopped the execution. Years later, after the war ended, after liberation and recovery and the long process of rebuilding, Jacques returned to Paris. He found his violin. It had survived. Confiscated but stored properly. Waiting. He played it in public for the first time in 6 years. A recital at the Conservatoire. Small audience. Friends and family and fellow musicians. He chose his program carefully. Schubert. Ave Maria. Bach. Partita No. 2. The Saraband. Brahms. Slow movement from the violin concerto. The same pieces he had heard in the execution courtyard. He played them as a memorial. As gratitude. As proof that music had value beyond entertainment. That beauty could interrupt death. That one person's choice to play violin at dawn could change everything for 12 condemned men. The audience listened in silence. When he finished, no one applauded immediately. The weight of the performance demanded quiet recognition before response. Finally, someone in the back row stood. Then another. Then the entire audience. Standing ovation. Not for technical skill. For survival. For memory. For refusing to let beauty die. Jacques bowed. He thought about the German violinist whose name he never learned. About Lieutenant Müller from Dresden who played music while the world demanded death. About the soldier who chose beauty over orders. He hoped Müller had survived. Hoped he was playing somewhere. Hoped he knew his music had mattered. In Dresden, Lieutenant Hans Müller sat in his apartment and listened to the radio. Classical music program. Brahms. The violin concerto. The orchestra was good. The soloist was excellent. The performance made him remember. He remembered the morning he played at Château de Vincennes. Remembered the cold courtyard. Remembered the prisoners tied to stakes. Remembered making the choice to play despite knowing it accomplished nothing permanent. But that was wrong. It had accomplished something. Not salvation. Not political change. Not military outcome. But something nonetheless. It had reminded everyone present that beauty existed. That humanity persisted. That music transcended the temporary madness of nations at war. His left hand ached. The frostbite damage had worsened over the years. He could not play professionally anymore. Could barely play at all. His violin sat in its case, silent, waiting for fingers that could no longer manage the technical demands of repertoire. But he did not regret playing that morning. Would not trade that choice for anything. Because music was meant for moments like that. Moments when the only appropriate response to death was beauty. The war ended. Years passed. The world rebuilt. Nations made peace. Borders shifted. But memory remained. In music conservatories across Europe, teachers sometimes told the story. About the German violinist and the French prisoners. About the morning execution stopped because of Schubert. About the power of beauty to interrupt death. The details varied. The names changed. But the essential truth persisted. Music matters. Even in wartime. Especially in wartime. When everything is designed to divide people into enemies, music reminds them of shared humanity. When efficiency demands silence, beauty demands voice. When death seems inevitable, art says, not yet. Jacques grew old. He taught at the Conservatoire. He gave occasional recitals. He lived a full life. But he never forgot the morning in the courtyard. Never forgot the distant violin. Never forgot the gift of those minutes when music existed between him and death. Sometimes students asked about his experience during the war. He told them about the resistance. About capture. About interrogation. About the execution that almost happened. And always, he told them about the music. Someone played violin, he would say. A German soldier. I never learned his name. But his music stopped the execution. Not permanently. Not politically. But for those minutes, death had to wait. Beauty demanded recognition. The students listened. Some understood immediately. Others needed time. But eventually, they all learned the lesson. Music is not entertainment. Music is necessity. Music is the human voice claiming that beauty matters even when the world says only power matters. That lesson lived beyond the war. Beyond the individuals who experienced that morning. Beyond the specific historical moment. It lived in every musician who chose to play even when silence seemed safer. In every composer who wrote beauty despite darkness. In every audience member who listened and recognized that art matters. Because it does matter. More than weapons. More than borders. More than ideologies that claim to justify violence. Music matters because it reminds us that we are human. That we share something deeper than nationality or politics or temporary conflicts. That beauty is not a luxury but a necessity for survival. Jacques understood this. Muller understood this. The firing squad that lowered their rifles understood this, if only for a moment. And decades later, when those who experienced that morning were gone, when the war had become history instead of memory, the story remained. A German soldier played violin at dawn. An execution stopped. Men lived who would have died. Music made that possible. And in the end, that was everything.